Hello and welcome to Sundata TV. My name is Kon Kakanis, Managing Director at Sundata, and welcome to episode 2 of our series. Today we're focusing on another element of owning and operating IBM Power technology, but the lessons also apply across all technologies. We're looking at high availability and disaster recovery solutions for today's business environment. Joining me today is Peter Sanderson, who's the MD of Team Computing Australia. Peter's organisation provides complex services to organisations around Australia using IBM Power technology, and they're also the distributor of the Unix HA solution for power. Joining Peter and myself is David Cole, who's a Sundata Enterprise Systems Specialist. David does a lot of really good work with enterprise clients for both compute and storage, primarily at the complex end of the requirements, and David's got a lot of input for today. So to start off, Peter, can you share with us your view on the level of need for HA-type solutions for clients running IBM Power infrastructure in Australia today?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Con, and thanks for having me today. Very pleased to join with you guys. Look, essentially, if a customer is running IBM Power systems in particular, they're clearly serious about their business. And while in the past it might have been acceptable to suffer outages during work days, to even suffer data loss where there were paper systems to resurrect information, these days it's absolutely critical that businesses have some kind of high availability or disaster recovery capability in their business. And particularly around IBM Power, it's really essential because these are systems that are running typically high volume transactional workloads. And if those transactions get lost, or if they're corrupted, or the system's unavailable for any reason, the business essentially stops. And for that reason, it's very important that people take that into account when they're running these sorts of systems.
Have you seen much shift in businesses extending their operating windows or reducing the availability of time for things like backups?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing now the vast majority of our customers won't accept any business hours outage, and that's been the case for a number of years. But increasingly, we're finding that even taking outages on weekends or overnight is increasingly less popular. It's harder to organise with the various business units that operate in a number of our customers, and effectively what they're trying to do is to remove any impact of any planned or unplanned downtime from all of their stakeholders, users, customers, suppliers, and the like, trading partners.
David, from your perspective of talking to clients in a lot of industries, what are you seeing that's driving these types of organisations to put HA capabilities onto their infrastructure?
Yeah, it's interesting in the terminology that we've seen change over the years, where people started talking about DR and everyone just used DR to refer to multiple things. Now there's a big focus on high availability and business continuity. And Pete raised a good point of downtime of both planned and unplanned. And it's the unplanned downtime that everyone thinks about or tries to address, but it's the planned downtime that is most likely to cause an impact. Everyone's getting squeezed with windows of doing maintenance, even doing backups and overnight processing. And if you're taking the system down every day to do backups or certain processes, that's downtime. If the users or the web or business partners can't get into the application because you're doing a backup, that's effectively an outage. And a lot of people are getting a squeeze on when they can take those outages and what the impact is to the business. End of days, backups, they're a critical part of business operations, but they do have a side impact.
Peter, what are the key elements of a business case that you've seen that have helped people get a HA investment approved?
Look, it boils down essentially to risk and their appetite for risk, and we're seeing that appetite is reducing. It centres around three main themes that we see. One is the amount of downtime they can stand, and that comes back to your what we call recovery time objective. How quickly can we get systems back up and running if we suffer an outage for any reason, planned or unplanned? Then you have data loss, which is the other thing that customers are seeking to avoid. And that could be as a result of an accidental deletion, some kind of corruption on board, or it could be something like malware attacking their environments. And they want to know that they've got a good recovery point objective, or RPO. And that essentially is how much data can we afford to lose? And increasingly that is trending towards zero. It's close to impossible to get zero, but it's certainly trending in that direction. And the third element, the thing that a lot of businesses now are taking more notice of, particularly in these days of very short news cycles and the availability of information about businesses, is their reputational damage that's taken through outages. And we've seen instances of customers that suffer millions and millions of dollars in fines from customers and or suppliers where they're unable to transact within a time frame.
How much education for business people are you seeing is required to make this a successful conversation?
Look, I think our role as IT professionals is partly to educate and partly to act as translators between the techno-babble that we speak on a day-to-day basis amongst ourselves and the things that actually matter for business. So RTO and RPO are actually very simple concepts, but we insist on using acronyms for them. Essentially, it's our job to work with business people to identify their current situation, identify what their needs are in terms of mitigating the risks associated with their current situation, and then help them understand the balance between the risks and the costs for implementing a solution such as high availability or DR. And in some circumstances, it could go up to the board level, and we kind of like it when it does, because at boards, they're discussing risk and governance all the time. So they get it. They understand risks and the elimination versus mitigation and those sorts of topics. So generally the education happens amongst those line of business people that perhaps don't understand what those risks could be.
David, could I come back to you? Can you tell us what you've seen in terms of what clients have used to build a HA business case?
Yeah, the traditional business case used to be a pure numbers game. So just looking at the revenue of the business, what's the impact of any downtime, whether it's planned or unplanned, and then multiplying that out across 12, 36, 60 months to justify the investment. As Pete indicated, it's a cost versus risk assessment that needs to be done, but quite often the business case these days is not just a straight financial discussion. There's also, as Pete indicated, there's the reputational impacts, there's governance and compliance around public companies and financial institutions, etc. So it's moving a little bit away from just the pure numbers, where we can justify the cost of the business of downtime or loss of revenue, loss of reputation, into a mix of tangible and intangible items.
What are the risks of not having clear communication across the business for a high availability solution?
The biggest risk with any organisation that is or has implemented a disaster recovery or high availability or business continuity plan is the definitions that are used across the width and breadth of an organisation are vastly different. We do have clients that the board get it, they talk it, they understand the risk, they understand the impact to the business. There's other organisations that we work with where IT understand what their limited capabilities are, possibly because they've never been given the budget. However, the business looks at IT reports saying, yes, we have a disaster recovery capability, and they think they know what that means. And it's not until either there's a full-on test or a disaster recovery exercise in real time that unfortunately the IT deliverables do not meet the business expectations. And that's the biggest risk, whether it's just by misinterpretation or different business units not being transparent as to what their capabilities are.
Peter, can you tell us about your experience and what you see as the key elements for a successful HA or business continuity implementation?
Yeah, absolutely. The key message when it comes to successful HA, once you've gotten past the point of defining what solution you're implementing and what risks you're wanting to mitigate, which you need to be very clear on, really the key for it is to practice, do tests, stress test the actual process of doing a DR. If you have multiple people who could be involved, make sure that you're involving those multiple people. Plan for some of those people to be unavailable, that sort of thing. So just practice a few different scenarios. Mimics, the tool that we'll be talking about later, provides virtual role swaps for that very function, which is really, really handy because it means you can do this non-disruptively. You could do one every week if you really were that way inclined. But more than just the practice, you have to learn from it. You have to review the tests you've done and be quite disciplined about implementing improvements to the process. And there does need to be a process for doing that. And finally, make sure it's documented and make sure that the documentation you've got around your plan is very accessible in the event of a disaster. That it's something that's frequently forgotten, and it needs to be accessible if you don't have a building anymore or people are unavailable.
And David, can I ask you the same question?
Yeah, as far as the implementation of the solution, it's really making sure that you're monitoring the capabilities of the solution around the requirements of the business and making sure that you maintain that capability. As Pete said, it's all about practice. It's about thinking about and planning for the scenarios and having a broad level of experience to be able to conduct a disaster exercise. Murphy's Law, means that we did have a client who had a malware attack on Christmas Day. Wasn't a day that most people were keen to put their hand up and jump in. So you've got to expect that there's going to be times where your key personnel aren't available. If you haven't done testing with clear documentation that's kept up to date and is accessible and have multiple people that are able to run the core function, then your outcomes are only going to be as successful as your preparation.
And David, what are the traps that you see people falling into when looking at business continuity and HA scenarios?
There is plenty of traps, and it is a big investment, because if you look at it, and if the organisation says, well, we're just going to duplicate our IT infrastructure for business continuity purposes, that's a fairly considerable investment, and if the solution's not mapped out to meet the business requirement, then there's going to be some tiers, and they're going to be very expensive tiers in the event of the worst case scenario. So really it starts as far back as actually gauging what the actual requirements are and having all of the business units sign off on what's critical to them to keep operating, whether that's telephones, or I know we had a client that their second most important piece of infrastructure was an old fax machine, because they were getting a lot of orders coming through via fax still a few years ago. So there's no point in having a disaster recovery solution that covers your core application if there's other critical pieces in the stack that are required to make the system functional. So we've got to have all of the core capabilities. We've got to have the service or the delivery of the business continuity, meeting the corporate requirements, and then just making sure as you go through that you plan and test according to those requirements and according to those scenarios. So things like just doing a standalone test of your core ERP application, that's fine to say yes, we can switch between site A and site B for our IBM I or AOX workloads, but what does that then mean for things like your business intelligence or any AI workloads or integration to business partners, etc.? If they're not tested as well, then you've only fixed part of the problem and probably created other problems which may actually not deliver the required business outcome. And as Peter said, there are companies that are dealing with let's use the major supermarkets as an example. You sign a contract with them and there's SLAs in place. If you can't deliver, then there's penalties that apply. And if you've got a B2B integration application that's not part of your BCP, then you're setting yourselves up for failure despite a very high expectation of success.
Peter, how about yourself? I'm sure you've seen a few potholes that people have encountered with this.
First is to make sure that your plan, and this is a pothole I've actually seen happen. I was asked by the managing director of a company to observe their disaster recovery test and offer suggestions along the way. They all met in their car park of their large factory at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning and said, okay, the building's on fire. What do we do? And somebody said, where's the DR plan? And somebody said, oh, it's in the safe. I'll just go and get it. And I put a stop to it and said, well, no. So make sure the plan's accessible. It's a pretty basic one, but it was quite funny at the time. Their MD wasn't very amused. Communication. So David touched on the technical communication, so our networks and how the machines talk to one another, but also about the people. Quite frequently, there's no communication between, and IT needs to put their hand up here a little bit. There's not a lot of communication about what our DR plans are to the rest of the business in some cases, and I see that as a trap. The business needs to know what's going on. People need to know what's expected of them, what they should be doing. And in the middle of the DR, make sure you're communicating with staff and also external stakeholders as well. Usually, if people know what's going on, they're a lot more calm about the situation. And we see a stark difference between the level of anxiety in plans where there's good communication and those where there's bad. And the final thing, we get very caught up in disaster recovery and high availability and how do we switch over and what do we do? But you have to have a back to normal plan. It's called business continuity, and the continuity bit is frequently forgotten. So you need to have a plan for getting back to normal operations. That doesn't have to be overly complex, but there does need to be consideration given to that, timeframes and costs, etc.
So what lessons have you learnt from actual HA events that you've been involved with?
Very simply, the people that have prepared and have tested are the ones that tend to do better. We've seen we've had customers call us who are not actually customers, but call us when they have a major event and they're unprepared, they're untested. We do what we can. It usually ends reasonably well, but not without a lot of blood, sweat and tears, both from them and us. So the ones that are prepared and tested better tend to be smoother. The other important one, the lesson we've learned, and this was hard won in one particular case we had, is to have a clear authority on who is allowed to actually initiate. We call it a disaster declaration, but who's allowed to initiate the disaster recovery plan. We had a situation where a customer had a major outage, but the line manager who was actually on deck at the time didn't feel authorised to declare a disaster, and it took a long time to locate the senior management and get that declared. It wasted a lot of time. And again, I'll come back to communication. While we're all beavering away feverishly trying to implement a DR plan or role swap machines or get networks talking to one another again, it's easy to forget that there are people who are hanging on what we're doing, and having even just one person whose job it is to keep people informed on a regular basis and to let people know when you will next communicate to them. We will come back to you in another hour, or we will come back to you in 2 hours, or our next update is at 4 p.m. Once that happens, the heat goes out of the situation because people know what to expect.
David, I'll throw the same question over to you now.
Yeah, it's nobody ever comes out of a real disaster recovery scenario without any blood, sweat, and tears.
True.
Probably what we see is, it's just a continual improvement on, what went well, what did we not think about, what did we need to focus on more that wasn't thought of as a critical piece of the solution. The other part is, just all the processes that go around the actual execution and the decisions that get made along the way. Pete sort of alluded to this. We had a client that is very savvy around their business and their requirements for uptime. they had a major hardware outage, and whilst looking at maintenance suppliers coming in to replace the issue, they were considering do we do a switch to our disaster recovery site, and the decision to make the switch took longer than the actual switch. So the lesson learned there was, if we have an issue, we'll just do the switch, because they are incredibly well versed in executing. So simplifying some of those pieces is quite often is a lesson learned that can really improve the outcomes. Don't sit around twiddling your thumbs thinking about things too much. If you've got a well executed plan and you can just cut over and continue the operations. If you only had a 50% capability in your disaster recovery, then it's a bit of a different scenario. Can we afford to run on a limited capacity if we do switch, or do we just wait? And some clients will choose to wait. The other part is having that conduit that's not an IT technical person quite often is a saviour. Let the IT people do their job. Have someone who understands the technology but also understands the business standing in between the two sides, so that the IT people aren't forced to try and simplify what they're up to and what their objectives are, and the business people can understand the status. And that can be a tough job in having that right person, but it needs to be a person that is clearly articulated, and you'd have multiple people in your plan to execute that. But it is a critical piece that's quite often not thought about.
Just getting back to what David was saying about companies that operate with smaller disaster recovery environments than their production, we're seeing that increasingly less. Most are now citing them to be similar to production. And in particular, the major banks we work with now don't refer to production and DR. They refer to it as production 1 and production 2. And both them and other businesses now operate on a situation where they will run for a particular period of time, might be 100 days or 6 months on one system, then they roll back to the other system and they run in that environment, so that they are always constantly aware of what it takes to do the role swaps in a live environment, and they actually run operationally on different kit at different times, different environments. And that can be really, really good. They're very well trained.
Have you seen some cases where a HA implementation has saved the company's bacon?
Yeah, we've seen the all ends of the capabilities. We have had some clients that have a very low stated expectation on their SLA of transition time, and they've had an outage, and suddenly all bets are off. We need this up as soon as possible. And one in particular that is in the food industry. So obviously you've got a dependency of, from hospitals, clubs, restaurants, etc., on getting fresh food delivered. So it's not like you can wait. And we have had some successful disaster recovery, business continuity exercises with those guys in real life. And that's led to, I guess, a heightened level of understanding across the whole business of what a business continuity plan is. And that's probably one of the most successful, because it was a very fast transition from an immature to a very mature expectation across IT and the business. And that's ongoing. And as Pete said, these guys now run 3 months in either of their 2 data centres at a time, and just have a very, very robust process to move from A to B. The other things that we've seen is clients that have a HA solution and haven't tested, and something goes wrong, and then it's how do we do this? And that's never a pleasant room to be in at that time, and that's the opposite end of the scale, where there's a very high expectation and a very low capability, and that's the mismatch that we do see at times. But I think organisations are becoming a lot better at preparing themselves. It's been a very, very slow uptake in getting to the point where people are ready for almost anything. Never be ready for everything, but it is becoming more of a heightened priority for businesses to be disaster recovery prepared, and as Pete said earlier, it's all about the practice. Test, test, test.
It reminds me of a client of ours where, after an unplanned outage, the board declared that they didn't realise how good an investment their HA solution was. Peter, I'll ask you the same question. Have there been any particular circumstances you've seen?
It's easy to pick on the ones that fail because they tend to fail spectacularly when they do. But a couple that I'll give you more success stories and how the outcome came about. We had one customer where they had a third-party engineer doing something to their machine. It was fixing a faulty part. Just through not really understanding the machine properly, they managed to fry part of the motherboard, a disk controller, and in the process, they corrupted every disk in the machine. They fiddled about for a day and a half trying to get this machine back up and running. Meanwhile, the business is going berserk. The IT people are going berserk. And finally, someone says, look, we've got Mimics. Maybe we should just roll swap. So they called us after a day and a half, and 2 hours later, they were up and operational on their Mimics solution. So similar to what you were just saying, all of a sudden they realized the value of having this solution in place and really learnt the value of having that available. And the other one was where we had a customer running your standard, garden variety power system, a whole lot of things hanging off it. They were very good at doing their DR testing, and we ran physical tests where we even relocated staff out of offices and ensured that everybody could connect to the DR capability. There was construction going on across the road, and somebody put a backhoe through a fibre optic cable, which left them completely dead to the world from their premises. Amazingly, they lost not a single transaction. There was nothing even in flight that got corrupted. And they were back up and running again within about 2 hours. And that included a physical move of some of their staff. So, I like those sort of stories because while they're a little scary, they have a good result because the businesses were prepared.
The other outcome, Con, that we try and achieve is, as part of the planning and the implementation, is taking advantage of the second set of data that you've now got, especially if you've got something like Mimics replicating in real time, then you've got a second set of the data. So I always describe high availability as an insurance policy that can keep paying out. It's like having a hire car sitting there in your driveway that you can drive at the same time as you've got your other car. In that, if we can offload workload from the production system, things like removing the overnight backups, populating data warehouses, etc. So we do see clients now take advantage of that second capability and offload some of the workloads or the downtime. And so they're just getting a day-to-day return on their investment rather than just waiting for the worst to occur.
Peter, just to sum up, what are the key things that the Mimics solution, provided by both Team and Sundata, can offer users of IBM Power infrastructure?
Being a high availability solution that works on the basis of logical replication, it obviously reduces your risk of loss. We can get to near zero RPO and a very fast RTO. Those 2 hour examples before, I've seen it happen in as quick as 10 minutes. It can be very, very fast once you've practiced. Also, Mimics is application aware, and this is something which you don't normally get in hardware replication technologies, which are all really good, but you could ultimately wind up with half a transaction on one system and not on the other, and it can be a problem there. Mimics is application aware, which means transactions are sent holistically across to the other system. Virtual role swaps is probably the biggest single benefit of Mimics over the top of other solutions out there. And that is that you can perform a role swap, leaving production, running production. Nobody knows it's even happening, but the DR or target machine can be made to look like the production environment. Your IT staff or certain business staff can log on, perform transactions, make sure everything's working, and then you turn it back to normal mode and it just catches up again. And it does that without exposure. The transactions from production are still going over. It's really one of the biggest advantages we have. Target database is not locked or dormant. as it is with hardware or SAM-based replication. You can use it for reporting to reduce load on production. You can use it to take your backups from the DR machine. And we do this in a lot of sites now, just to remove those outage windows from production. You can partially replicate an environment. And this means if you have 40 terabytes of data on production, you may only need to replicate 20 terabytes of that. But if you're doing hardware-based replication, the lot goes regardless. We provide not only high availability and disaster recovery, but try to think of it as a tool that really is very good at moving your production environments around. And when you think of it in those terms, you can use it when you upgrade or change your application. You can use it to move to the new environment with very, very minimal downtime. So they're just a few of the things that Mimics can do.
And David, before we finish, can you give us an update on the HA-specific capabilities available in an IBM Power environment these days?
Yeah, there's a few really good offerings that IBM have around the Power, because obviously it's a high value piece of infrastructure. If we're talking about IBM sites, the software investment can exceed the hardware investment from IBM. So IBM have really come to the party. Probably the one that we use the most often, and has been around for quite some time, is the capacity backup, or CBU, which is like the HA edition of the Power systems, where you buy a second machine with minimal hardware capabilities from a CPU perspective, minimal licensing, and you can float your licenses between your production and your CBU system in the event of a role swap, even if it's just for a test. Second to that is we use a lot of capacity on demand, where we can just turn on and off resources as required. And that's CPU and memory. For a new extension of that is a new offering called Mobile Enterprise Pools 2.0, where you can start moving resources, physical resources like CPU allocations and memory activations, between systems. So we have one client who uses the pools extensively, where we move across their CPU allocations, their IBM licensing, and also a terabyte or so of memory between their production 1 and their production 2 systems. So they can maximize the allocation and the utilization of their systems, rather than having a dormant set of hardware that's fully spec'd up and sitting there just being trickle-fed replication via Mimics. You mentioned live partition mobility. That's been around for quite some time, primarily from an AOX perspective. But now we've got that in IBM where we can pick up a live workload and move in real time to another system. And that's not necessarily, it's not a disaster recovery product, but it's a high availability. So clients that use live partition mobility are really just moving workloads in preparation primarily for planned maintenance. So it might be a patching weekend coming up. On the Friday afternoon, they just move the workload from machine A to machine B. The system works out, memory allocations and data between the two systems. There's a small glitch. The system might freeze for the user for half a second, and then they're running on the second machine, unbeknownst to the user. And the other thing that's really changing over the last few years is this little thing called cloud, where clients are now looking at using cloud solutions like offered by Sundata and IBM to either have their production and HA or just their HA, and also the on-site offerings that have now been announced by IBM, so you can have your private cloud on a Power system and really treat it as a utility expense for both your production and your DR capabilities. So, which has really changed the economics of provisioning these multi-site deployments.
All right, gentlemen, I really do appreciate your time and your insights today, and I hope our audience has gained some further knowledge around IBM Power technology and the higher availability solutions on offer. Thank you for joining us on Sundata TV, and we'll see you next time.